86.23%. Look at this number. It feels smart, doesn't it? It feels objective. It feels safe. If I tell management our translation quality is up 2% this quarter, everyone nods. We have turned the messy and chaotic reality of human language into a clean engineering problem, right? That's what everybody wants when it comes to quantifying the subjective. It's a very important human characteristic. Now, here's the truth. And what's really hard to admit is that this number, this 86.23%, is in itself a hallucination. For 40 years, we have treated language as a math problem. We convinced ourselves that if we could just find the right formula, BLEU, TER, COMET, any form of machine translation quality evaluation, or MTQE, we could compress meaning into a floating point number. Why? Because until recently, computers couldn't understand words. They could only count them. We had to rely on quantitative data because it was the only way to make language actionable at scale. But it's 2026 and that limitation is gone. Now we have the power to compute semantics directly, thanks to the large language models. We can interact with meaning, not just math. But for some reason, our industry is holding on so tightly to its technical baggage, refusing to let go of the score, often even clinging even more onto it. But today, I'm going to argue that words are actually so much smarter than numbers when it comes to machine translation quality evaluation. And if you're still making decisions based on 86.23%, in my opinion, you're not managing quality, you're managing a mirage. And let's take this back all the way to the 1970s when we were talking about rules and the early beginnings of machine translation. So to understand how we got trapped in this scoring mindset, we have to look at the machines themselves, right? So machine translation isn't just one thing. It evolved through 3 eras, and each one pushed us deeper into the math. First came rule-based machine translation, or RBMT. This was linguistics. If the machine broke, you opened the hood and fixed a grammar rule. It was transparent. You didn't need a score to tell you it failed. You could see the rule violation. So very predictable, very standardized. It's basically transposing grammar into a machine. And obviously, I'm simplifying and in many ways hyperbolizing, but it's important for the purpose of this video just to understand that initially it was more about grammar. Then came quite an evolution from a meaning perspective, the statistical MT, or SMT. It changed everything because we could no longer focus on teaching computers grammar. Now we could focus on feeding them massive data sets. The machine calculated the PE of F, so the probability of English, for instance, given French. This was the birth of the math view. The translation wasn't right or wrong, it was highly probable. And this is also really important because this plays a really important role in the evolution of large language models and things like that, because we began thinking of language more as a thing of an element of probability and less of a grammatical set of rules and entities that had to be followed and symbols, etc. Now, we have neural machine translation and LLMs. So these are next token predictors, right? Neural MT was already a precursor of large language models in many ways. And they don't count phrases. They navigate a 700-dimensional vector space to hallucinate the most fluent sounding continuation, right? So that's what a large language model is doing. They're incredibly powerful, but they're opaque. That's what everybody says. A large language model, as amazing as it is, it's pretty much a black box. Because we couldn't see inside the black box, we've never been able to see inside the black box, we kind of panicked. We needed a way to police it. We needed a metric. And that's where machine translation quality evaluation comes in, or quality estimation comes in. It's, in my opinion, the industry's desperate attempt to predict, is this black box telling the truth? And what's interesting, even from this question, my gut reaction is I want to hear a yes or no. I don't want to hear it 86.23% true, because I don't know what to do with that, right? If you just take a step back and think about someone tells you something and you're unsure of the veracity of what they're saying, and someone else says, you know what, trust me, what they're saying is 86.23% true. What do you do with that? What about the 14 or so percent that are untrue? Where are they? What is it about, right? So it's, when it comes to truth, in my opinion, when you get out of the Boolean true or false, it becomes really, really hard to act on anything like that. This brings us to the original sin. To build machine translation quality estimation, first we build metrics like BLEU, the BLEU score. And I want to show you exactly how, I don't like the word, but how reductionistic these metrics are, so you understand why 86% is meaningless in this scenario. So BLEU, for instance, and by the way, I'm saying BLEU, but it's BLEU, B-L-E-U. It works based on n-grams. So it's literally counting overlapping chunks of words. There's a reference translation. For instance, the system is unavailable. And then there's the machine translation. For instance, the system is available. BLEU sees the system is and available as different words. It sees, in this case, a 4 out of 5 match, which is 80% accuracy. This is pretty good. It gives the translation an A-, but semantically, it's a catastrophic failure, because it says the exact opposite of the truth. And by the way, this is the same thing with fuzzy matches, and that's why they're so irrelevant, in my opinion, in this day and age, because maybe you're saying the same sentence, right? The system is unavailable, the system is available. That would probably be a very high fuzzy match, maybe just guessing here, maybe not 90% fuzzy match, but semantically, diametrically opposite, right? The system is available versus unavailable. The issue is that the metric measures surface similarity, not semantic equivalence. And that's really what's at heart of what we're discussing here. And yet, this kind of metric, it's in the DNA of our entire quality infrastructure. We built an entire industry on counting word matches and calling it quality. Whenever I show, for instance, the context-sensitive characteristics of BureauWorks and how we use a RAG framework to produce highly contextualized translations using large language models and machine translation and translation memories, typically the first question that I get is, can I get a score? Can I measure how good this is? That's very prevalent in how people think. People want to be able to see how good or how bad, and they want this in a number, right? Just like people want grades when they're doing an English essay. They want to know that they're getting an A- or a B+. There's this very heavy societal bias towards quantitative being better, more objective, cleaner than anything that's linguistic, subjective. This brings us to this big shift from right or wrong to actually from how accurate to right or wrong and where. What if we get rid of the score? What replaces it? What is the alternative to a score? In software engineering, there's a concept called code smells. A code smell isn't necessarily a bug. The code runs, it compiles, but it looks smelly. Maybe the function is too long. Maybe the variables are named poorly. It indicates a deeper weakness in the design. We need to treat language, in our opinion, in the same way. We need to move from asking, is this right or wrong, to what does this smell like? This is the philosophy behind BureauWorks translation smells. We don't just look for errors. We look for characteristics. There could be, for instance, an ambiguity smell. The sentence could be interpreted in two ways. An inconsistency smell. You could use the word client in one paragraph and customer in paragraph 2. A tone smell. The source is apologetic, but the target is defensive, right? So smells are literally whiffs of things that could be off with language. And they're by nature qualitative. It's not that something smells 90% good or 80% good or 83% good. It's about what could be potentially wrong with that. And let me just share my screen and show you exactly what I mean by that. So when we talk about smells, we're talking about picking up these specific whiffs in the text. And why is this so powerful? Because it doesn't give you a number, it gives you a diagnosis. It doesn't say score 0.6, it says caution, gender polarity shift. This transforms the user from a grader into a doctor. So this shift is super important, right? You go from a grader into a doctor. You're actually treating the condition. You're not just checking for pass or fail. Now, I have to be honest with you. We've also, on top of the smells, we've generated what we call a confidence score, which is an amalgamation of all of these smells that are then ranked according to severity. For instance, let's say a grammar smell is probably less significant than a semantic smell and so on. But I really don't like it. We calculate it by collecting all of those smells, all of the inconsistencies, the glossaries mismatches, the tone drifts, and we weight them by the severities. And if the document has 0 smells, for instance, it gets 100%. If it has critical terminology smells, the score drops. But this is where the irony comes in. We built this feature because the market demanded it. People wanted to be able to upload files into BureauWorks, and they wanted to be able to know how confident they could be in those files. And they didn't want to read a paragraph-long analysis of the confidence level. They wanted to see something very neat, very clean, that they could make a decision on. Let's say they could look at this text and say, okay, this is 86.23% accurate. Do I want to just use it as is? Do I want to get this reviewed by a human professional. And procurement departments need a number to put in a spreadsheet. Companies need numbers. That's the only way you can report things. That's the only way you can measure things. And from way back from Peter Drucker and other continuous improvement experts, the idea is if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So there's a very strong corporate bias towards numbers. Managers, they need a number to justify their budget. But internally, we know it's a dead end because the score is a Trojan horse in many ways. It's a way to get people comfortable with the technology. But if you stop at the score, you miss the point because the value is 85% confidence. The value is knowing exactly the diagnosis, that the 15% uncertainty comes from 3 specific ambiguous legal terms. The score is the map. The smells are the territory. And we cannot confuse the two, right? And this is what's super important. If we have the specific smells, we can address it. So this brings me back to my core thesis, right? In 2026, the words are so much more informative and actionable than the numbers because the large language models, they give us the power to act on semantics. Before, we had to rely on quantitative data because it was the only way to act on something at scale. So you could write a rule, for instance. If the score is less than 80, then, for instance, send to human. But now we can interact with meaning. If the analysis says the transition is accurate but wordy, we can act on that. We can trigger a specific model, rewrite to be concise. We can send it to a human, but with very specific instructions on what the diagnosis is. If the analysis says the transition changes the meaning of the brand slogan, we can act on that. We can trigger a specific alert, do not publish. When you reduce meaning to a score like 80% good or 86.23% good, we're basically getting rid of all of the richness of the data that we need to fix the problem in the first place. But when you keep the words, the analysis of the smells, you have a roadmap for improvement. So words analyzing other words carry way, way, way more weight than any decimal point ever could, even though we have such a huge bias towards loving the decimal points. And this leads me to my final and most critical point. You might ask, if the AI can detect the smells and AI knows how to fix them, why don't we just let it fix everything automatically? And this is the danger zone. The application of the correction, that delicate, that final mile of output management is precisely the part that, in my opinion, must not be outsourced to a model. Why? Because that is what authorship is. Authorship isn't typing. Authorship is choice. If the AI writes the draft and the AI critiques the draft and the AI fixes the draft, well, who's the author, right? Nobody. It becomes just statistical noise, vectors on vectors on vectors, and dimensions on dimensions on dimensions. And the whole cultural embodiment of the work that's being produced is lost. But the power of translation smells, for instance, is that it empowers the human to make the final judgment. It's flagging out things. It's pointing out things, sometimes things that are not super relevant, sometimes things that are incredibly relevant. It's reducing cognitive load because now you have an additional set of eyes that's looking at things with you. And it can learn from your changes as well. So if you are ignoring certain kinds of mistakes, it can learn from that. And if you're focusing on certain kinds of other mistakes, it could learn from that. So there's this iterative potential as well that's incredible in smells. And the power is that it says, the eye says, for instance, this sounds aggressive, but the human says, good, I want it to sound aggressive, ignore, right? So it's deferring that decision, that human intervention. That, in my opinion, is the definition of authorship because there's a choice that's being made. And in my opinion, if we're to get rid of the AI slop, but still be really productive in 2026, we need mechanisms that bring the right things to our attention, but we still need to be in control. And that moment, the decision to ignore or to apply is where the human value lies. If we are to surrender that, then we aren't translators anymore, we're just spectators. And it's really interesting here, just a parenthetical note, is that I noticed that there's this huge misperception on how to use AI. There's a lot of people that I know that focus on wanting to use AI, particularly on this last mile. They want the AI to review the text. They want the AI to implement changes. In my opinion, that's completely the wrong approach from a sustainability and scalability perspective. Where the AI is really good at is producing a rough draft. It's really, especially in translation, can be amazing at producing a rough draft. Where it's going to falter and fail is in making these little tiny decisions, these little adjustments that really make a big difference when it comes to how the text is received by someone. Because again, language, in my opinion, isn't something about right or wrong. Obviously, you could get into infinite arguments around the accuracy of a translation. But in my opinion, ultimately, it's about the effectiveness of communication. I can translate something semantically correct, but if it doesn't achieve its purpose, right? If it doesn't get the user to click on that button, if it doesn't get the user to interact with the brand, to engage with the video, then something's wrong. And that's what matters to brands. That's what matters to companies. That's what matters to people. Translation has always been a vehicle, a vessel for results, not just something in and of itself. And that even requires, in my opinion, universities and people who teach language to have a much more functional perspective over what language is there for, because there's so much emphasis in understanding language as a reflection of something that's being abstracted from it. So again, if we go back to the structuralists and we go back to the Swiss school of language and this idea that language is this representation of the world versus language is something that's doing something to the world, which would be a more postmodern interpretation of language. That's where we are right now, in my opinion, in 2026. Language is about getting things done. Language is about accomplishing certain reactions. It's about delivering certain feelings. And if we're not delivering those feelings, it doesn't matter how accurately it's written, it's not going to be effective. So we are at a transition point. The people that are clinging to MTQE and BLEU scores, they are doing so because it's what they know. It feels rigorous because it involves math. And we love math. Anything that is mathy is smart. It sounds objective. It seems great. But the future isn't just about better scores. It's about better diagnostics. It's about pointing out exactly where the failure could be. It's about moving from, is this 86% to, does this smell like our brand? And at BureauWorks, we built the confidence score to help you transition. But we build transition smells to help you succeed. Because if we stop grading language like an exam and you start treating it like a living, breathing thing that needs to be understood, not just calculated, then you have room to be human. And above all, keep that decision in a human arbitrator. Because in my opinion, that's what we're here for. If we're not keeping these decisions for ourselves, then we're losing complete control over the production of language. And if that happens, then there's a very quick, slippery slope towards meaninglessness. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like and subscribe. Leave me your comments. Would love to know what you think. Thanks so much, and until next time. Bye-bye.